The rejection happened on a Thursday. Not that the day of the week mattered, in the grand scheme of ruined lives and shattered destinies. But there is something particularly insulting about having your soul cleaved in two on a Thursday. Mondays, people expected disaster. Thursdays were supposed to be unremarkable. Claudia had been standing in the great hall of Ironspire Keep when it happened. She remembered every detail with the kind of precision that pain carves into memory and refuses to let go. The way the torches made the gray stone walls amber. The way the hounds near the hearth lifted their heads when she walked in, as though they already knew. The way Alpha Daren Ashford stood with his back to her for a long moment before he turned around, and the way his jaw was set like a man who had already decided something and was merely getting through the formality of saying it aloud. She had just turned 20. She had walked into that hall wearing her best riding cloak because her mother had told her to look presentable when she met her mate for the first time. She had spent the morning trying to tame her dark hair and had failed, and had decided it did not matter because fate was fate and surely fate did not care about hair. She had been so young. "I reject you," Darren said. 3 words. The same number of words as "I love you," as "I need help," as "pass the salt." 3 small words that landed like a broadaxe. Claudia felt the bond, that luminous, terrifying thread that had ignited in her chest the moment she'd crossed the threshold and her wolf had gone absolutely still with recognition. Snap. It did not snap cleanly. Nothing ever does. It was more like watching a bridge collapse from the inside. The structure held for one impossible moment, and then it came apart, piece by piece, from the center outward, and the sound it made inside her was not a sound at all, but an absence of one. She stood there for 3 full seconds, staring at Darren Ashford, this tall, dark-haired, gray-eyed man who was apparently her mate and was apparently appalled by this, and she waited to see if she was going to cry. She did not cry. What she felt instead was something colder and more durable than tears. The quiet click of a door closing inside her, the precise and deliberate moment when a person decides that this, whatever this is not going to be the thing that destroys them. "Very well," she said. And she turned around. And she walked out. She did not look back. Neither of them knew, in that moment, that the woman walking out of that hall was the last surviving heir to the throne of Verath, that the blood running quiet in her veins was the oldest royal blood on the continent, that the kingdom she did not yet know was hers was already waiting for her, and had been for 20 years, concealed behind a lie her mother had died to protect. Darren Ashford would spend the next 8 months sleeping poorly and making his entire pack miserable. He would spend them pushing away the phantom ache behind his ribs that no healer could explain and no amount of work could dull. He would spend them telling himself, with diminishing conviction, that he had made the right choice. He had not, of course, made the right choice. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. This is the story of a rejection. And a crown. And 2 people who were catastrophically wrong about who they were and what they deserved, and had to lose nearly everything before they were willing to admit it. It is, despite its unpromising beginning, a love story. Just not a simple one. Chapter 1. Ironspire Keep sat in the northern reaches of the Ashford Pack territory, like a declaration of intent. It was not a beautiful fortress. It had not been built to be beautiful. It had been built to be difficult to attack, and in this ambition it had succeeded admirably for 400 years. Its walls were thick enough to lose a man inside, its towers were perpetually cold, and its great hall had an echo problem that meant private conversations were, in practice, not very private at all. Claudia had traveled 3 days to reach it. Her home pack, the Halvern Pack, a modest but respected group settled in the river valleys to the south, had arranged the meeting through the proper channels. A letter had come the previous month, sealed with the Ashford wolf crest, confirming that Alpha Daren would receive the Halvern Omega Claudia at Ironspire on the 14th of the new moon. Her packmaster had been pleased. Her mother, had she still been alive, would have been pleased. Claudia herself had been cautiously optimistic, in the way that a person is cautiously optimistic about a thing they have spent their entire life being told to expect and have therefore worked up a complicated relationship with. The mate bond was supposed to be sacred, a gift from the moon goddess herself, a recognition between two wolves that was meant to transcend class and rank and circumstance. In practice, of course, it was somewhat more complicated than the old song suggested. Claudia was an Omega. Daren Ashford was an Alpha. Not just any Alpha, but the ruling Alpha of one of the three most powerful packs in the Northern Territories, a man who commanded 300 wolves and answered to no one except the distant and largely ceremonial authority of the High Council. The gap between their stations was not a gap, so much as an abyss, and Claudia was not so naive as to have missed this. She had, however, allowed herself to hope. This was, in retrospect, the mistake. She had felt the bond the moment she walked through the great hall's doors. It had been unmistakable, like stepping from a dim corridor into direct sunlight, like the first breath after a long submersion, like every metaphor she had ever read in the old stories and dismissed as romantic exaggeration. Her wolf had simply gone. Oh, as though recognizing something it had been searching for, without knowing it was searching. Daren Ashford had been standing with his back to her, speaking to his beta. He had gone very still, and then he had turned, and she had seen his face. He was not what she had expected. She was not sure what she had expected, precisely. The romantic stories tended toward descriptors like magnificent and commanding that rendered the actual man somewhat abstract. What she saw was a person, a tired one, a person who had, apparently, just experienced the same seismic recognition she had, and whose immediate response to it was something that looked disturbingly like dismay. She had given him the time to compose himself. This had perhaps been her second mistake. His beta, a broad-shouldered man named Torben, who had the expression of someone watching a fire he had been quietly dreading materialize, withdrew from the hall with the practiced smoothness of a man who recognized a conversation he did not want to witness. And then it had been just the two of them, and the echo, and the hounds by the fire, and the moment that Claudia would spend the next 8 months trying and failing to stop replaying. "I know what you are," Darren had said, finally. His voice was low, not unkind, worse than unkind, somehow careful. The voice of a man who had thought about this and arrived at a conclusion he had decided to stand by. "I know what this is." "So do I," Claudia said. "Then you understand why." "I don't," she said. "Not yet." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something move through his gray eyes that she could not name, something that was not cold, not calculated, not the simple disdain she had braced herself for. Something almost like pain, which made no sense, which she filed away in the part of her mind that handled things she did not yet have the context to interpret. "I am an alpha," he said, as though she might have somehow missed this. "My pack requires." "I am aware of what your pack requires," Claudia said. She was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I am asking why it requires it of me." "You're an Omega." He said it plainly, not cruelly, but plainly, as though the word contained within it all the explanation that was needed. And perhaps, in the world as it was constituted at that particular moment, in the Northern Territories, in the Ashford Pack, in the political reality that Daren Ashford had inherited and never questioned, it did. Claudia considered this. She considered his gray eyes and his careful face, and the pain she thought she had seen move through him. She considered the bond still humming in her chest like a plucked string, diminished now but not gone. It would not be gone until he said the words, until the formal rejection was spoken, and some part of her wolf was still, absurdly, waiting for him to decide otherwise. She gave him one more moment. He said the words, and she walked out. What Claudia did not do, in the days and weeks that followed, was fall apart. This was perhaps surprising, given the circumstances. The rejection of a mate bond was not a small injury. It was, by every account she had ever encountered, one of the most significant wounds a wolf could sustain. The old healers had written about it. The storytellers had composed entire tragedies about it. There were ceremonies to ease the separation, rituals to help the severed wolf grieve and recover. Claudia had none of those resources. What she had was a 3-day journey home, a packmaster who watched her with carefully neutral eyes, and a small stone cottage on the edge of the Halvern village where she lived alone. She arrived home on a Sunday. She unpacked her traveling bag. She put the kettle on. She sat down at her kitchen table, and she stayed there for a very long time, not moving, just breathing, just being in the space of what had happened. She did not cry. She had decided, somewhere on that second day of riding with her jaw set and her eyes on the road, that she was not going to give the rejection a single tear. This was not stoicism, exactly. It was closer to a decision about who she intended to be. After an hour at the kitchen table, she picked up the kettle and made tea. After 3 days, she went back to work. After a month, she was almost used to the hollow space where the bond had been. Almost. The thing about wounds, the kind that go deep enough to reach bone, is that they do not heal at the rate you want them to. They heal at the rate they want to. And the severed mate bond did not heal so much as calcify, became part of her, became scar tissue, became the particular kind of ache that one stops noticing in good hours and notices acutely in bad ones. She was, on balance, managing. This was the state of things when the first soldiers arrived. Chapter 2. They came on horseback, 12 of them, wearing armor that did not belong to any pack Claudia had ever encountered. It was old armor, not old and worn, but old and deliberate, the kind of craftsmanship that had been preserved across generations because it was too significant to replace. The crest on their breastplates was a crowned wolf mid-howl, rendered in silver on deep blue. Claudia was in her herb garden when they arrived. She straightened from her work, soil on her hands, a cutting knife in her grip, and looked at 12 armored soldiers in the road outside her cottage, and experienced the specific and bracing feeling of a person whose quiet life has just been interrupted by something large. "Claudia of the Halvern pack," said the woman at the head of the column. She was silver-haired and severe, her back straight as a blade, her dark eyes scanning Claudia with the efficiency of someone conducting a rapid and professional assessment. Born on the night of the winter solstice, 20 years past, daughter of Adeline and, until now, unnamed father. That's a fairly intimate way to introduce yourself to someone you haven't met, Claudia said. She did not put the knife down. Not out of aggression, precisely. More because it seemed sensible to hold onto something solid. The silver-haired woman almost smiled. "My name is Commander Saya of the Verath Royal Guard. I've been looking for you for 8 years. I've been in this garden for most of them," Claudia said. "You weren't looking very hard." This time the woman did smile. It was a brief smile, careful, but genuine. "Your mother hid you well. She was an exceptional woman." The mention of her mother landed differently than Claudia expected. Not with pain, exactly. That pain was old and worn smooth by now, but with a sudden sharp attention, the feeling of a puzzle piece being offered that she did not yet know was part of a puzzle. "What do you want?" Claudia asked. "The truth is somewhat involved," Commander Saya said. "May I come inside?" The story that Saya told, sitting across from Claudia at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, was this. 21 years ago, the Kingdom of Verath, the oldest sovereign wolf kingdom on the continent, ruling the lands east of the mountain range that the northern packs called the Grey Walls, had been torn apart by a succession crisis. The king, Aldred Verath III, had died without a declared heir. His queen had died in the same sickness. What he had left behind was a brother, Merrick, with ambitions and a following, and a daughter whose existence only a handful of people knew about, because she had been born to a woman who was not the queen, and because the king, aware of his brother's ruthlessness and aware of his own failing health, had made certain choices. He had sent the child away. He had sent her west, with her mother, with a new name and a sealed letter and the knowledge that if she were ever found by the wrong people, she would not survive the finding. Adeline, Claudia's mother, had settled among the Halvern pack. She had built a quiet life. She had raised her daughter as an Omega, as a member of the pack, as a person who belonged to the valley and the river and the herb garden, and not to thrones or succession crises or the complicated machinery of kingdoms. And then, 8 years ago, Adeline had died. A fever, swift and pitiless, the kind that takes people before anyone has properly said goodbye. She had left, on the kitchen table, a sealed letter. Claudia had read that letter. She had read it twice, and then she had folded it up and put it in the bottom of the cedar chest where she kept her mother's things, and she had told herself, with the same quiet deliberateness she brought to most decisions, that she needed time to understand what it meant before she decided what to do with it. 8 years had passed. She had been, she now admitted, somewhat avoidant about this. "You read the letter," Saya said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Claudia said. "And you said nothing." "I said nothing. For 8 years." "I was," Claudia said, processing. Saya looked at her for a long moment. There was something in the look that was not quite exasperation and not quite admiration, and was perhaps a mixture of the two that had not previously had a name. "Your uncle has been on the Verath throne for 20 years, she said finally. "He has not been a good king." "I gathered as much," Claudia said. "People who kill their brother's heirs in order to take thrones generally aren't. He does not know you're alive. Or rather, he has suspected, but he has not been able to find you." Saya paused. "He found your mother's old contact 3 months ago. We learned of it. We came first." Claudia looked at her hands, at the soil still caught under her fingernails from the herb garden, at the cutting knife on the table beside her teacup. She thought about Daren Ashford saying she was an Omega as though it explained everything. She thought about the severed bond in her chest, its familiar ache, its quiet scar. She thought about her mother, who had chosen a quiet valley and a small cottage and a false name and a lifetime of silence to keep her daughter safe, and who had never told her daughter any of this while she was alive, because some truths are too heavy to give to a child. "If I come with you," Claudia said slowly, "what happens?" "You take your throne," Saya said. "You return to Verath. Your uncle's claim becomes illegal the moment you are recognized. You are the true heir." "And if I don't?" Saya's expression did not change. "Your uncle's people will find you, and they will not be here to offer you tea." Claudia nodded once. She stood up from the table. She went to the cedar chest. She retrieved the letter. She read it one more time. Her father's handwriting, which she had never seen before in anything else, careful and precise, and carrying in every stroke the weight of a man trying to say enough in a very limited amount of words. She had been 8 years old when she first read it. She was 20 now. The words were the same. She was not. "Give me an hour to pack," she said. "Before we continue, I'd like you to let me know in the comment section where you are currently watching this story from. Also, do not forget to like and hit the subscribe button for more interesting werewolf romance stories." Chapter 3. We should check in, briefly, on Darren Ashford. This is perhaps uncomfortable, given what we know about him. He is not, at this point in the story, a sympathetic figure. He made a choice, a cold, calculated, status-driven choice, and a woman walked out of his great hall carrying his decision in her chest like a wound, and he watched her go, and he told himself it was the right thing. We want to be very clear, it was not the right thing. Darren, to his credit, was also starting to suspect this. The month after the rejection, he had been fine. Functional. He had told himself the hollow ache behind his ribs was simply the adjustment period, the natural consequence of a mate bond initiated and severed, an inconvenience that would pass. He had thrown himself into pack business. There was always pack business, and he had eaten regular meals and held counsel and done all the things a functioning alpha was supposed to do. The second month he had been slightly less fine. The hollow ache had not passed. It had, if anything, deepened. Not dramatically. He was not the sort of man given to dramatic displays, but quietly and persistently, the way water works on stone. He had started to notice small things. He noticed the absence of a presence he had never actually experienced, which made no logical sense. He noticed that he was irritable in a directionless way, irritable at weather and food and the perfectly reasonable administrative requests of his council members. He noticed, most inconveniently, that he had developed a habit of stopping in the middle of tasks and staring at nothing for intervals that his beta Torben tracked with increasing concern. Torben, who had been Darren's beta for 6 years and his closest friend for 12, had not said anything immediately. He was a patient man and a careful one, and he understood that Darren needed to arrive at certain conclusions under his own power, because Darren arriving at conclusions under pressure from other people was, historically, counterproductive. He had waited. For months in, Torben finally said something. They were in the training yard, running drills with the younger wolves in the pack's warrior cohort, and Darren had stopped mid-correction and stood with his hands loose at his sides and the expression of a man attempting to locate a thought that keeps moving just out of reach. "Is it getting worse?" Torben asked. Darren turned to look at him. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Darren considered this. The training yard was cold. It was always cold at Ironspire. The wind off the mountains did not permit otherwise, and the young wolves had gone still, watching their alpha with the alert wariness of people who sensed something significant was happening. "Fall out," Darren said to them. Then, to Torben, "Walk with me." They walked to the parapet that faced south. It was a clear day, the mountains stark against a white sky, the valley below spread out in its winter emptiness. Darren stood with his hands on the cold stone and looked at the southern road. "Tell me," Torben said. Darren was silent for a moment. "I made the right decision," he said. It came out with slightly less conviction than he had intended. "Did you?" "She was an Omega. My pack requires." "I know what you told her," Torben said. "I know what you told yourself. I'm asking what you think now, for months later, after sleeping badly and being unpleasant to our council and staring at the south road like it owes you something." Darren's jaw tightened. "I think," he said, after a long pause, "that I may have been operating on assumptions I did not examine." Torben breathed out through his nose. This was, from Torben, the equivalent of a dramatic exclamation. "For months," he said. 4 months to get there. I am thorough. You are stubborn. Same thing." Torben leaned his forearms on the parapet. "What are you going to do about it?" "I don't know yet," Darren said. He looked down at the south road. "She's a long way away." "She is," Torben agreed. "And every day she gets further." He didn't know then how profoundly accurate that was. While Darren was standing on his parapet reconsidering his choices, Claudia was 3 days east of the Grey Walls and getting further by the hour. The road to Verath was nothing like the valley she had grown up in. It was wilder, the landscape shifting from the gentle river country of the Halvern lands through dense pine forest and then into the long, elevated plains that the Verath people called the Windfields. The sky was enormous here. The grass bent in permanent waves from a westerly wind that never seemed to entirely stop. The mountains were behind her now, and the world felt wider than she was accustomed to, which was both exhilarating and faintly terrifying. Commander Saya rode beside her and answered questions with the patience of someone who had been waiting a long time to have this conversation. "How many people know I'm alive?" Claudia asked on the second day, out of the Halvern territory. "Within the guard, 12. Within the kingdom, fewer than 5. Saya paused. "Your uncle does not know, or he would have moved more aggressively before now. What does he know? That your mother fled, that she went west, that she was never found. A brief pause. He knows that the king had a child. He has never been entirely certain whether that child survived. 20 years is a long time to sit on an uncertain throne. It is, Saya agreed. It has not made him a more pleasant man. Claudia thought about this. She thought about the strangeness of having a family she had never known, a father's handwriting on a letter, an uncle's throne built on a lie, a kingdom that had been waiting, in some abstract sense, for her whole life. She thought about how different the shapes of things looked when you finally understood what you were looking at. Tell me about Verath, she said. Saya told her. The kingdom was old, older than the pact system in the Western territories, older than most of the political structures that currently carved up the continent. It had been built on the principle that wolves could govern as wolves, that the instinct for hierarchy and loyalty that ran through their nature could be channeled into something more durable than conquest. The early Verath kings had been unusual rulers, not only powerful in the physical sense, but scholars, diplomats, people who had understood that authority was most stable when it was also legitimate. Merrick, her uncle, had none of those qualities. He had the authority. He had spent 20 years assembling the legitimacy through a combination of force and propaganda and the simple arithmetic of being the only person standing. He was not, Saya said, entirely without political skill. He had kept the kingdom from fracturing. He had maintained the borders and the trade routes and the basic machinery of governance. He had also taxed his people into exhaustion, suppressed 3 attempted uprisings, and quietly eliminated anyone whose bloodline made them inconvenient. He's been trying to have me killed, Claudia said. It was not quite a question.
Twice, Saya said.
We intercepted the second attempt 6 weeks ago. That was what precipitated our decision to find you. A fission of him, Claudia said. He's a thorough man. Apparently it runs in families, Claudia said, and was surprised to hear something almost like dark humor in her own voice. Grief, she had learned, had a way of arriving in unexpected forms. Sometimes it arrived as laughter, sharp and brief, because the alternative was worse. They arrived in Verath on the 8th day. The capital city was called Halvard, not to be confused with her former pack. The names were coincidental, and she had always found it faintly strange, and it sat at the junction of 3 rivers, protected on the north by the Grey Walls and on the east by a natural bluff that had been fortified into the city's outer wall centuries ago. It was, by any reasonable measure, an impressive city. It was large and old and layered with history in the way that very old cities are, each era of building pressed against the next, the ancient stone of the original walls supporting the newer towers, the original market square surrounded by a century of accumulated growth. It smelled of river water and baking bread and the particular combination of wood smoke and cold air that Claudia, for reasons she could not entirely explain, found herself responding to as though to something familiar. As though something in her blood recognized it. She had thought she was prepared for this. She found, riding through the outer gates, that she was not. Chapter 4. The plan, as Saya laid it out in the safe house 3 streets from the palace, was this. Claudia would not announce herself publicly. Not yet. None till they had secured allies within the court, people who remembered the old king, people who had spent 20 years in quiet opposition to Marek's reign, people who would recognize the royal bloodline and act on it. There were more of these people than Merrick suspected, because Merrick was the kind of man who believed that power crushed all opposition, and had therefore missed the category of people who had learned, very carefully, how to be opposed to him without being visible about it. These allies would need to see her first. They would need to be certain. Certain of what? Claudia asked. That you are who you are, Saya said. And that you are someone who can actually lead. That's 2 separate criteria.
Yes.
The bloodline is the first. You are your father's daughter. Anyone who knew him will see it. The second is more complicated. Saya looked at her with those steady dark eyes. You've spent your life as an omega in a pack society. You've had no formal training, no experience with court politics, no practice with a specific kind of authority required of a ruling monarch.
She paused.
You are also, from what I have observed in 10 days, someone who walked out of a mate rejection without falling apart and spent 8 years holding on to a secret that most people would have been broken by, and who made a life's decision in under an hour and has not wavered from it since. Claudia considered this summary. You're saying there's potential, she said. I'm saying, Saya replied, that the qualities that make a good ruler are not always the ones that formal training produces. Sometimes they're the ones that survive in the absence of it. The first meeting was 3 days later. It was held in a private library on the palace's eastern wing, a room that technically belonged to the head archivist, an elderly man named Prosper who had served 3 kings and survived all of them through the simple expedient of making himself so quietly indispensable that even Merrick could not justify removing him. Prosper had been one of the king's most trusted advisors, 21 years ago. He had been the one who sealed the letter. He had been one of the 5 people who knew. He was 83 years old, and he moved with the careful economy of a man who has learned to spend his energy deliberately. When Saya brought Claudia into the library and closed the door, he looked at her for a very long time without speaking. Well, he said, finally. His voice was dry and precise, the voice of someone who had spent a lifetime choosing words carefully. You have his eyes. I've been told, Claudia said, though I never had anything to compare them to. Gray, Prosper said. Gray with that particular quality, as though they are lit from behind. Aldred had that. A pause. Your mother's nose, though, which is perhaps fortunate for you. Was my father's nose problematic? It was, Prosper said gravely, somewhat assertive. Claudia laughed. It was not a polite, controlled laugh but a genuine one, slightly startled out of her, and she saw something shift in Prosper's careful expression at the sound of it. He used to laugh like that, the old man said.
His voice was quieter now.
Your father, exactly like that. And that, Claudia found, was the moment Verath became real to her. Not the journey, not the gates, not the sight of the palace. This old man recognizing something in her laugh that she could not even see herself, this connection to a father she had never known, this proof that she was not invented but descended, not constructed but continuous. She pressed her lips together. She breathed through her nose. She did not cry because she had decided about crying, but it was a closer thing than most moments had been. Over the following 2 weeks, Saya brought her to 7 more of these meetings. Each one was careful, private, conducted with the particular delicacy of people who understood that what they were doing was quietly treasonous to the currently installed king, and who had decided to do it anyway. There was a woman named Sarah, a former lady of the court who had been exiled to her family estate after her late husband had been too openly critical of Merrick, and who received Claudia in a drawing room crowded with dogs and warm fires, and spoke with the direct, undecorated frankness of a woman who had lost enough to have no patience for pretense. You'll have to be harder than you look, Sarah told her after about 20 minutes of conversation. How hard do I look? Claudia asked. Sarah's mouth curved. Not very. Which is the point. Your uncle will underestimate you. Most of them will, at first. The question is whether you can use that before they stop doing it. How long do I have? Until you do something that frightens them, Sarah said. Which, if you're the right person for this, won't take long. There was Lord Fen, young, anxious, the son of one of the old king's most loyal generals, who spent their entire meeting alternating between barely concealed excitement and barely concealed terror and managed to be, despite this, Genuinely useful because he was the one who had maintained contact with the northern border garrison, a significant military asset that Merrick believed was securely his own. And there was, on the 14th day, the complication. The complication arrived in the form of a messenger from the Western Territories, breathless from hard riding, carrying a letter sealed with the Ashford wolf crest. Claudia stared at the crest for a long moment. "That is," she said carefully to Saya, "not something I was expecting." "No," Saya agreed. She had the expression of someone who is rapidly revising a plan. "Neither was I." The letter was from Torben, not from Darren himself, which told Claudia something, and it was short and direct and made her feel several things simultaneously, none of which she particularly wanted to examine at that moment. Torben wrote that he had heard rumors, the kind of rumors that spread fast in the political circles connecting the Western Pact territories to the Eastern kingdoms, about a woman of unknown lineage arriving in Verath under the protection of the royal guard. He wrote that Darren had been in no fit state to write this letter himself, which Torben clearly felt needed to be stated. He wrote, with a frankness that she recognized as Torben's particular gift, that the Ashford Pack was willing to offer its support and alliance to the Verath claim if, and he had underlined this with some force, if the claimant was willing to receive it. He had signed it, with respect, and on behalf of an Alpha who is extremely sorry and does not yet know how to say so. Claudia folded the letter. She set it on the table. She looked at it.
"Well," she said. "Your call," Saya said.
"Generous of you. I try." Claudia picked up the letter again. She read it twice more. She thought about Daren Ashford's gray eyes and his careful face, and the pain she had thought she saw in them, and the bond that was a scar now but had once been a song, and the choice he had made, and the choice she had made afterward. She thought about kingdoms and thrones, and the things that were already set in motion. "Write back," she said finally. "Tell them that the Verath claimant does not currently have the time or the inclination to manage someone else's emotional reckoning in the middle of a succession crisis. If the Ashford Pack wishes to offer political alliance, they may submit their terms formally through Commander Saya."
She paused.
"Tell Torben thank you for the candor." Saya almost smiled. "And Darren? He knows where I am," Claudia said. "He can make his own way here."
Chapter 5.
What Darren actually did was arrive in Halvard 14 days later, having ridden at a pace that deeply concerned his horse and alarmed his entire escort, with no formal advance notice and no prepared speech, and exactly one clear objective: to see her. This was not, his beta had pointed out before he left, the most politically sophisticated approach. "Noted," Darren had said, and left anyway. He had spent the 4 months since the rejection constructing an increasingly complicated and increasingly unconvincing set of reasons why he had been correct. He had built this structure carefully. He had reinforced it regularly. He had stood inside it and looked out at the South Road and told himself it was solid. The letter from Verath had taken the structure apart in about 11 minutes. It was not the content, precisely. It was not the discovery that Claudia was the heir to a kingdom, though that had certainly landed with some force. It was the way Torben had described finding out. The image of sitting in the map room at Ironspire going over trade route reports and hearing through 3 degrees of rumor that the Omega Darren had rejected 8 months ago was apparently a royal heir in exile, and the particular sensation Torben described of watching his Alpha absorb this information, which he likened, memorably, to watching a man realize he had been sitting on the edge of a cliff and had only just looked down. "I made an error in judgment," Darren said, on the evening before he rode out. He and Torben were in the great hall, which was empty except for the 2 of them and the hounds by the fire. "Yes," Torben said. "I want to correct it. I know. I'm not going because she's a queen," Darren said, and his voice had an edge to it. Not anger, but something more uncomfortable. Conviction, perhaps. The kind that costs something. I want to be very clear about that. The bond, the rejection, that was wrong of me regardless of who she is. Her being a queen makes it worse, but it doesn't change the fundamental thing. Torben looked at him. I know, he said again more quietly. I didn't examine my assumptions, Darren said. I had ideas about what my pack required, about what an alpha's mate should be, about what strength looked like, and I didn't examine any of them. I just acted on them. He stopped. She stood in front of me, and she was extraordinary, Torben. She was extraordinary, and I rejected her in about 45 seconds because she didn't fit a framework I'd never even questioned. Yes, Torben said. That's it? Just yes. What else do you want me to say? You've spent 8 months getting here. I'm not going to argue with you now that you've arrived. Darren looked into the fire. The hounds, sensing something, shifted and resettled. The echo moved through the great hall. She's not going to make this easy, he said. Absolutely not, Torben agreed, with what seemed to Darren like slightly too much relish. She's going to make it very difficult, and frankly she should, and you're going to have to earn it. I know, Darren said. He rode out the next morning before the sun was up. The road to Verath took most people 8 to 10 days at a comfortable pace. Darren covered it in 6, which his escort would later refer to, in subdued voices, as the ride. He was not reckless with his horses. He was too experienced a horseman for that, but he was relentless in the way that a person is relentless when they are outrunning something, which in this case was the fear that if he arrived late something would already be decided, and he would find himself standing outside a door that had been closed. He arrived in Halvard on a gray afternoon unannounced. Commander Saya met him at the safe house. She was not, he noted, surprised to see him, which suggested that she had expected this, or had been warned, or both. She looked at him with the expression of a soldier conducting an assessment. You came, she said. I came, he agreed. She said you could find your own way here. I found my own way here. A brief pause. Saya appeared to be making a decision. She is in a council meeting, she said. You'll wait. Darren waited. He was not generally good at waiting. He was, by nature and by the habits of authority, accustomed to things happening when he decided they should happen. Waiting in a safe house in an unfamiliar city while the woman he had wronged conducted kingdom business 3 streets away was not a comfortable experience. He sat with it. He thought it was probably appropriate that it wasn't comfortable. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Claudia arrived in the safe house with the kind of energy that filled a room without effort. Not loudness, not performance, but presence, the particular quality of a person who has spent a great deal of time recently having to be entirely present and has gotten very good at it. She stopped in the doorway when she saw him. Her expression did not change. Her dark eyes moved over him with the same measured quality he remembered, the same assessment that he had found, 8 months ago, disconcerting and now recognized as one of the most honest things anyone had ever directed at him. She looked well. She looked, in fact, remarkable. There was something in her bearing that had not been there in his great hall, or perhaps had been there and he had not paid enough attention to see it. A quality of arrival, he thought. The look of a person who had found their footing. Daren Ashford, she said. Claudia, he said. That's an interesting response. I expected you to use a title. I don't know what title to use, he said. I'm not sure what to call you yet. She looked at him for a moment. You can call me Claudia, she said. For now. A pause that contained a great deal. Sit down. He sat down. She sat across from him, with a distance between them that was not accidental, and she folded her hands on the table and looked at him with those gray eyes, her father's eyes, though she did not know yet that he knew this, and she said, simply, Why are you here? And Darren, who had been composing some version of this answer for 6 hard days of riding and 8 longer months of arriving at it, said, Because I was wrong. Not wrong, because of who you turned out to be. Wrong about who you were when you were standing in front of me, and I wasn't paying enough attention to see it. Silence. That's a better answer than I expected, Claudia said. I had time to work on it. 8 months is a long time. It is, he agreed. I used some of it badly, and some of it reasonably productively. Her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. The shape of one that was deciding whether or not to arrive. I'm in the middle of a succession crisis, she said. I have a throne to reclaim, an uncle who's tried to have me killed twice, and a political coalition that is currently held together by goodwill and the particular tension of people who have been waiting a long time for something to be different. She looked at him steadily. I don't have time to also manage the fallout of a rejected mate bond. I know, he said. I'm telling you this, she continued, because I want to be honest with you about the situation, not because I'm asking you to leave.
A beat.
You're not asking me to leave, he said. Not yet. She sat back. The Ashford Pack's political weight in the Northern Territories is significant. An alliance with you would strengthen my coalition considerably. A pause. That is a pragmatic reason to let you stay. I'm telling you it's pragmatic, so you understand I haven't made a decision about the other thing. The other thing, he said. Yes. That's very diplomatic language. I'm learning to be diplomatic, she said, with the precision of someone who finds the project interesting but is not going to pretend it's natural. It is, frankly, exhausting. This time the thing he had been suppressing for 6 days of writing and 8 months before that did reach his face. He did not try to stop it. It was a small thing, genuine and involuntary, and he thought, watching her, that she noticed it. I would like, he said carefully, to be useful to you.
To the extent that I can be.
Without the expectation of anything in return. She looked at him for a long time.
Can you fight? She said.
Yes. Can you be honest when the situation requires something you don't want to give? A pause. I am learning to be. That's an honest answer about honesty, she said. I'll give you points for that. She stood up. She extended her hand across the table. Not the gesture of a mate, not the gesture of a woman willing to return to a bond, but the gesture of someone offering something more provisional and more real. You can stay, she said. You can serve the claim. We will see what else follows.
He took her hand.
It was the first time he had touched her. He realized, in the great hall, there had been no touch, only words. Her hand was warm, and the scar of the broken bond ached in his chest with an intensity he had not felt since the day after the rejection, because that was the thing about proximity. It reminded the wound of what it was reaching for. He did not let the ache show on his face. He thought that was probably the least he owed her.
Thank you, he said.
Don't thank me yet, Claudia said. Wait until you've met my uncle. Chapter 6. Merrick Verath was 54 years old and looked, Darren thought upon eventually seeing him at distance, like a man who had spent 20 years being afraid and had spent all that time converting the fear into aggression. He was not physically impressive, shorter than his reputation, thinner than his portraits, with quick eyes that moved constantly over a room in the restless way of someone who has learned to be perpetually watchful. He wore his authority like a garment he was not entirely certain fit, and the overcompensation made him dangerous in a particular way, the kind of danger that comes not from strength, but from the willingness to do extreme things to avoid appearing weak. Claudia had assessed him, Darren knew, with the same efficiency she brought to everything. He's frightened, she told the council, on the 4th day after Darren's arrival, in the library where Prosper served as chair and the maps of the palace and city had been spread across the long table. He has been frightened for 20 years. Frightened men make predictable choices.
She paused.
The question is not whether he'll try to move against us once he knows I'm here.
He will.
The question is when and on what grounds, and whether we've built enough of a coalition to weather it. We have 8 of the 12 noble houses, said Lord Fenn, who had graduated, in the 2 weeks since his first meeting with Claudia, from barely concealed terror to a slightly more composed version of the same. The northern garrison has confirmed through back channels that their commander will stand with the true heir when the claim is made public. A pause. The city's merchant guilds are cautiously sympathetic. They've spent a decade absorbing Marek's trade levies. Cautiously sympathetic, Sarah said, with the tone of a woman who had seen a great deal of cautious sympathy fail to translate into useful action. In other words, they'll celebrate after we've won. That's all we need them to do, Claudia said. Sarah looked at her, and the look had something in it that had not been there in their first meeting. Not approval exactly, but a kind of recognition. You have been paying attention, she said. I am paying attention, Claudia said. Continuously. It's somewhat all-consuming. Welcome to being a queen, Sarah said drily. The issue was timing. They had the pieces, or most of them. What they did not have was a moment. The right moment. The moment that would make the public declaration not a gamble, but an inevitability, that would give the uncertain allies the confidence to step forward and leave Marek with nothing to stand on. This was the part of the plan that Darren, who was primarily useful in a military capacity and was aware of the limits of his role, found himself listening to with something between professional admiration and a more personal kind of attention. Claudia in a council room was not Claudia in the safe house, not Claudia in the quiet conversation, and not Claudia in his great hall. She was faster here, more precise, the kind of quick that had been honed by something rather than simply present. She moved through the map of the situation with an instinctive grasp of the political geometry that Prosper watched with an expression Darren had begun to recognize as the old man's version of satisfaction. She thinks like Aldred did, Prosper said, on the evening of the 4th day, quietly, to Darren alone as they stood in the corridor outside the library. Your father thought in structures, he had told Claudia once. You think in movements. It was, Prosper said, the difference between a good administrator and a good ruler. She doesn't need me for this, Darren said. No, Prosper agreed. Not for this. He looked at Darren with the measured gaze of a man who had 8 decades of context for human foolishness and was therefore neither surprised nor unsympathetic. That is not, I think, why you're here. No, Darren said. Then be here for the right reason, Prosper said, and be patient. She is not yet done deciding what to do with you. The moment came 11 days after Darren's arrival. It came because Marek, who was not a stupid man even if he was a frightened one, had his own network of informants, and one of those informants had, eventually, gotten close enough to the right conversation to deliver a fragment of something that was, while not conclusive, alarming. Marek could not have known everything, but he knew enough to know he had a problem, and Marek's response to problems was to act before they became larger. He called for the Northern Garrison commander. This was the move that Prosper had predicted, if not precisely on this timeline. The Northern Garrison was the military piece. Marek was trying to secure it before the situation resolved against him. Saya brought the news to the safe house at midnight. She did not knock particularly gently. We need to move tomorrow, she said. Claudia, who had been awake, Darren suspected she slept less than she should and was not going to say so because it would be both patronizing and incorrect that it was entirely his business, looked at Saya across the table. The garrison? His messenger is already riding. Can we intercept?
Possibly.
It's a risk. Claudia looked at the maps. She was very still for a moment, the kind of stillness that was not absence but concentration, the kind that Darren had watched now for almost 2 weeks and had come to understand as the way she processed things that mattered. Her hands were flat on the table. Her gray eyes moved across the map with the characteristic quality of someone following a logic. Then, no, she said. We don't intercept. We make the interception irrelevant. She looked up at Saya. We don't need to stop his message from reaching the garrison. We need the garrison to have already heard from me before it arrives. Saya looked at her. That requires being in 2 places. It requires 2 fast riders and a letter with my seal. Prosper's seal, too. The garrison commander knows Prosper. That matters. She was moving now, pulling a sheet of parchment from the stack at the corner of the table. We move the announcement forward. Not tomorrow, tonight. I make the claim before dawn. By the time Merrick understands what has happened, the allies who have been waiting will have been given the signal they needed. It's fast, Saya said. It's meant to be, Claudia said. She looked at Saya steadily. This is what he was afraid of. He knew something was moving and he couldn't stop it, so he's trying to control the last piece he can reach. We don't let him reach it. Saya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'll prepare the riders. Darren had been standing by the door, taking no space in the conversation, which was as it should be. As Saya left, Claudia looked at him. I need you tonight, she said. Not in the council. Outside the palace. If Merrick moves before dawn, if he has other resources we haven't accounted for. I'll be there, he said. She looked at him. In the lamplight, her eyes had that quality Prosper had described, lit from behind, gray and deep. You rode 6 days to get here, she said. Yes. You didn't have to. I know. A pause. I'm glad you came, she said. It was quiet and unadorned and more, because of its simplicity, than anything decorated could have been. He did not say you have no idea how glad I am. He did not say anything about the 8 months or the hollow ache or the things he had built and torn down inside himself. There would be time for that or there would not, and either outcome was something he had done to himself with his own choices. He said, Tell me where you need me. Chapter 7. The announcement was made in the palace's great court at the 4th bell before dawn. It was not the grand, torchlit ceremony of old stories. There were no banners unfurled or trumpets sounded, no choreographed moment of theatrical revelation. What there was, instead, was Claudia walking into the court at the 4th bell with Prosper at her right hand and Saya at her left, and 8 of the 12 noble houses ranged behind her, and standing in the center of that old stone space and speaking, without theater and without decoration, simply the truth. Who she was, whose daughter, what she carried, why she had come. She had thought about this speech for 14 days, and had in the end discarded most of what she had prepared and said what was most true. She had told them about her mother, who had hidden her and died without telling her, and who had left a letter on a kitchen table in a River Valley cottage that Claudia had read at 8 years old and had spent 12 years gathering enough life to understand. She had told them about the valley and the pack and the life she had lived, not apologetically, but as evidence of something, that the blood that ran in her veins had not been able to be educated or trained out of her, that it had found its way through a quiet life in a way that could not have been manufactured. She was, she said, her father's daughter. She was asking for nothing on the strength of that alone. She was asking for something on the strength of what they would see in the days ahead. Merrick was not there. Merrick was, according to Saya's latest information, in his private chambers on the north side of the palace, where the news had reached him approximately 20 minutes before the announcement, and where he was currently engaged in what Saya described as an intense conversation with his advisors. The reaction in the court was not the unified roar of old stories either. It was complex and layered and human, and it was what Claudia had expected. Relief from some quarters, visible shock from others, calculation from several faces she had already identified as Marek's people who were now revising their calculations at speed. There were tears from an older woman in the 3rd rank who had served her father and had been old enough to remember. There was the particular quality of silence from the crowd that was not emptiness but held breath, the silence of people trying to decide whether to believe and wanting to. It was not, in other words, a smooth victory. It was a beginning. Prosper stood beside her when it was done and said, quietly, "That was well done."
"It was honest," she said.
"Those are not always the same thing," Prosper said. "Tonight they were." The 3 days that followed were complicated, which is perhaps the mildest possible way to describe a succession crisis being actively contested in real time. Merrick did not concede. This had been expected. What he did was move his remaining allies into positions that made the already fragile situation considerably more precarious, and issue a counter-declaration of his own which, while legally groundless given that Claudia's bloodline was not in serious doubt, created enough noise to require response. There were 2 tense nights during which Darren was, frankly, more useful to Claudia than either of them had fully anticipated, not because anything came to open violence, but because there were 3 separate moments in which the presence of an alpha of his rank and reputation, standing visibly in support of the Verath claim, caused people who had been carefully equivocating to finish their calculations and choose a side. Authority, it turned out, had a contagion. The right person committed in the right moment could tip several quieter commitments after them. He did not call attention to this. He noted it privately and considered it. On the 4th day, Marek's coalition fractured. It did not fracture spectacularly. It fractured the way these things tend to in practice. Quietly, person by person, each person privately concluding that the side they were on was the losing side, and that it was better to be wrong early than wrong late. By the afternoon of the 4th day, Merrick had 3 noble houses and the palace household guard, and a diminishing supply of confidence that any of these were going to be sufficient. He sent for Prosper. Claudia let Prosper go. She and Saya and Darren waited in the library where so much of this had been planned, and Claudia sat with her hands folded on the table and was very still in that concentrated way, and Darren sat across from her and did not ask questions because she did not need questions, and Saya stood by the window and watched the palace courtyard. Prosper came back 2 hours later.
"He wants terms," the old man said.
The room breathed. "He's not going to fight it," Claudia said. It was not quite a question. "He's a frightened man who has survived 20 years by knowing when to stop," Prosper said. "He looked at the numbers this morning. He knows what they mean." Claudia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Exile. Comfortable exile. I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in it being finished. His properties in the eastern provinces will revert to the crown, but his personal household can follow him." A pause. "He cannot stay on the continent. There are island territories to the south that receive political exiles." Prosper nodded. "And his associates?" "Amnesty for those who were acting under duress. Accountability for those who were not." She looked at Prosper steadily. "You know which is which." "I do," he said. "Then I trust your judgment," she said. The formal transfer of authority took place on the 7th day. It was a ceremony of the old rites. Prosper had insisted on this, and Claudia had agreed because the old rites were the ones her father had used, and there was a kind of continuity in that which mattered both symbolically and, she was beginning to understand, politically. Symbols were not decorations. They were structures. They told people what to see and how to see it, and the story of continuity, of an interrupted reign restored, of a daughter coming home, was a story that people needed, that the kingdom needed, in a way that no purely pragmatic account of bloodlines and legal claims could fully supply. She was crowned in the morning, in the throne room, with Prosper holding the crown and Saya at attention to her left, and the 8 noble houses arranged behind her in their proper order, and the late winter sunlight coming through the high windows and falling, in that particular quality that only winter light has, like something deliberate. She sat in her father's throne for the first time and felt the weight of it. It was heavy. That was the first, honest, wordless impression, not of power or destiny or triumph, but simply of weight. The weight of the thing she had stepped into. She sat with the weight of it. She thought it was something she was going to have to learn to carry, and that she was going to learn by carrying it. She looked out at the court. In the back of the room, near the doors, she found Darren's gray eyes. He was standing with his hands clasped behind him, straight-backed, and he was watching her with an expression that was harder to read than most of his expressions, which were not, in general, easy to read. But she had been watching him for nearly 3 weeks, and she had gotten, she thought, better at the translation. There was pride in it, not the possessive kind. The kind that a person feels when they have witnessed something real. There was something else, too, quieter and less certain. The look of a man who was trying to hold something carefully because he knew it was not yet his to hold. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the court and the wait and the work. Chapter 8. The weeks after the coronation were not triumphant in any simple sense. They were busy, primarily, relentlessly busy, with the accumulated business of a kingdom that had been managed for 20 years by a frightened man and was showing the specific damage that frightened management produces. Claudia worked at hours that concerned Saya and alarmed Prosper and caused Sarah to arrive periodically with food and direct instructions that she should eat it, because apparently Sarah had decided that the advisory function she had spent the last 2 weeks performing could be extended to include nutritional enforcement, and Claudia did not have the energy to argue. Darren stayed. He had not announced that he was staying. He had not asked permission. He had simply continued to be there, useful in the quiet, specific ways that became apparent to a new queen trying to hold a newly stabilized kingdom together. Present for the council discussions where his Northern Territory's perspective was genuinely relevant, available for the security assessments that Saya conducted with the combination of thoroughness and bleak humor that Claudia had come to rely on, and completely absent from anything that was not asked of him, which she found, after the weeks of everyone having opinions about what she should be doing, almost disorientingly considerate. They talked in the evenings, not every evening, not as a ritual or a deliberate cultivation of something. But the nature of the work brought them into the same spaces at the same times, and the conversations that grew from that were not conversations about the thing they were not yet discussing, the bond, the rejection, the 8 months, the things that would eventually need to be addressed, but about everything adjacent to it. She told him about her mother. He listened without interrupting, which she noted, and mentioned it once. "You don't interrupt," she said. "I'm trying," he said, with a rueful quality that she found, despite herself, endearing. "I have been informed on several occasions that I talk over people. I'm attempting to become aware of the habit." "Who informed you?"
Torben.
"Several times. The first few times, I didn't believe him." She laughed, and he watched the laugh with the same expression she had caught before, that involuntary thing, genuine and unguarded, and they sat with the conversation for a while in the particular way of two people who are both aware of a significant thing they are not yet saying and are, by not saying it, somehow communicating it anyway. He told her about Ironspire, about the pack and the responsibilities and the framework he had built his decisions inside of, the framework he had never questioned until the questioning came too late. He did not excuse himself. He explained which is different, and he was precise about the distinction. "I wanted to know why," Claudia said once, quietly. They were in the library, late, the fire burning low. "Not what the reasons were. The reasons I could construct myself. I wanted to know why those reasons felt sufficient to you."
"Why you didn't?" She stopped.
"Didn't look closer," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Because I was afraid," he said. "Not of you. Of the disruption. Of what it would mean to take a mate who didn't fit the shape of what I'd told my pack and myself I needed." A pause. Fear is very efficient at dressing itself up as reason. I have been, I think, quite good at that. She looked at him. "And now," he said, "I would like to try being less efficient about it." The bond was still there. This was the thing they did not say directly for a while. The rejection had not severed it entirely. Claudia had known this distantly, had felt the damaged thread that had not gone fully dark, the scar that was too warm to be entirely dead. Being in the same space as him for 3 weeks, and then 6, and then 8, had made it impossible to pretend otherwise. It ached in the particular way of something that was trying to heal rather than something that had given up. She was the one who said it first, on a night when the work had been long and the library was quiet, and she was tired enough to have less patience with circumnavigation than usual.
"The bond," she said.
He looked at her. "It didn't break completely," she said.
"No," he said.
"Careful. I don't know what to do with that yet," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I know what I feel, and I know what happened, and I know those two things are going to take time to be in the same place." "I know," he said. "You've been patient," she said. "I've noticed. I had a great deal of time to understand that patience was what was appropriate," he said. 8 months is a long time to understand something about yourself. What did you understand? He looked at her steadily. That I had been very stupid, he said. And that stupid was not a sufficient reason to stop trying.
She thought about this.
She thought about the kitchen table and the letter and the 45 seconds in the great hall that had cost them both more than they should have been required to pay. She thought about Ironspire and the South Road, and the weeks of his watchful, careful, useful presence and the conversations and the way he listened. "The bond asks for something," she said slowly. "It asks for me to trust a thing that was already broken once by that person's choice." "Yes," he said. "That's not a small ask." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." Silence. "The fire." "I'm not saying no," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying no to this. I'm saying—" She paused, looking for the exact right words, because the exact right words were the only ones that would be fair. "I'm saying that this goes at the pace I set, and that the pace will not be fast, and that I need you to hold the patience you've found and not lose it when it's inconvenient." "Yes," he said. "And I need you to tell me when something is difficult," she said. "Not to manage me, but because I'm not interested in a version of this where one person carries the weight of what was done to them quietly forever while the other person feels they've been forgiven." He was very still. "I need it to be honest," she said. "Yes," he said. And then quieter. "So do I." She looked at him for a long time in the low firelight, in the library where Prosper had been waiting for 20 years for a daughter to come home, in the kingdom that had been held in some kind of suspended grief since the night a young king sent his infant heir west to keep her alive. "Then we'll start there," she said. He breathed. It was small but real. The exhale of someone who has been holding something carefully for a very long time and has just been told they can set it down. "Yes," he said. "We will." There is an old custom in Verath, older than the Grey Walls and older than the pack system to the west and possibly older than writing. On the night of the winter solstice, the ruling monarch of the kingdom is required, by tradition, to light the first fire of the season in the great court. Not a servant, not a steward, the monarch themselves, flint in hand. It is, by design, not a grand gesture. It is a small one. It is the point. Claudia was in her 2nd year on the throne when she stood in the great court on the winter solstice, with the cold of the season pressing in from every direction and her breath visible in the lamplight, and struck the flint above the pyre. She thought, briefly, about the first fire she had ever lit for herself, a small fire in a river valley cottage, after her mother's death, the first night alone. She thought about all the fires between that one and this one, and what they had cost, and what they had given her. The fire caught. The court made the sound it was supposed to make. Prosper, who had seen this ceremony done by her grandfather and her father and her uncle and now her, watched with the expression of a man completing something. Darren was standing to her right. Not as a consort. That title had come 6 months earlier, in a ceremony that was, at Claudia's insistence, Not especially grand and not especially rushed, and was exactly what it was, honest. Not as a supplicant or a figure of apology or a man still earning something. He had been earning things for long enough.
She had told him so.
He was standing there as himself. As the person who had ridden 6 days because he needed to tell her he had been wrong. As the alpha who had learned, belatedly and expensively, that the assumptions of his life were not the same thing as the truth of it. As, in the plainest possible terms, her mate. The scar in her chest had softened. Not vanished. It would never entirely vanish. And she had decided, some months ago, that she did not want it to, because the scar was true and truth was something she had decided to hold on to, even the parts of it that were not comfortable to carry.
But softened.
Settled into something that was no longer the primary story, that had been joined by other things, newer and growing. She looked at him in the firelight. He looked back. "Well," he said, under the sound of the court around them, quietly enough that only she could hear. "Well," she agreed. "You've had the throne for 2 years," he said. "Is it what you expected?" "I expected it to be heavier," she said. "It is, in fact, exactly as heavy as I expected. I don't know why I thought I was wrong." "Because you are occasionally optimistic about the limits of difficulty." "I am not optimistic. You walked out of a rejection without crying and started a revolution," he said. "That is, at minimum, structurally optimistic." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, with a particular tone that he had come to recognize as the one where she was choosing between several possible responses and had selected the one that was truest, "I didn't start a revolution. I lit a letter on fire and got on a horse." "History," he said, "tends to simplify." "History," she replied, "can manage its own interpretation." He was smiling. He did this more than he had in the first months, and she had noticed the increase, and she noted it now, this particular quality of it, the one that was entirely unself-conscious, the one that was, she thought, possibly the truest thing she had yet seen in him. She thought about the great hall at Ironspire, about the 45 seconds, about the way she had decided, in the 3 days riding home, who she was going to be. She thought, with a fairness that had taken time to arrive at, that he had spent a comparable amount of time deciding who he was going to be. That the man standing next to her had been made partly by the choice he had gotten wrong, and everything he had done since. She had not forgiven the choice. Forgiveness was not really the right word for what had happened, because what had happened was something more complex and more human than simple forgiveness. She had held the truth of what he had done, and she had held the truth of who he had become, and she had decided that both were real and that she did not have to choose between them. That she could hold the damage and the repair in the same hands and still choose what to do next. She had chosen this. The fire burned in the great court. The winter solstice night was very cold and very clear, the kind of night where the stars look like they have been hammered into the sky with particular attention to detail. Claudia looked up at the stars. She thought about her father, who had sent her west into a quiet valley to keep her alive. She thought about her mother, who had lived the quiet valley and given her daughter a letter and enough of a life to know what to do with the truth when it finally arrived. She thought about all of it, and she thought, yes, this. Complicated and real and entirely mine. "Come inside," she said to Darren. "It's cold. You are the one who had to light the fire outdoors." "It's tradition." "Tradition is simply habit with better clothes," he said. She laughed, short and genuine, and the night held the sound of it, and the fire burned, and the stars were many. They went inside. And that is where we will leave them. Not at a perfect ending. There is no such thing, and they would both be the first to tell you so. There are the ordinary difficulties of ruling a kingdom and managing an alliance and being two people with histories trying to build something honest from the materials of what they are. There is Prosper, who is getting older and will not be there forever, and Saya, who is quietly invaluable and knows it, and Torben, who visits occasionally from the north and makes jokes that are funnier than Darren lets on. There is the work, which is endless, and the fire, which needs to be lit every year. There is the bond, which is a scar, and something else, which is real. There is, at the beginning of all of this, before the throne and the coalition and the 7-day ride and the careful evenings in the library, a woman walking out of a great hall, straight-backed, choosing to be something that could not be broken. And a man standing in the echo of his own choice, beginning the long and necessary work of understanding it. There is all of that, and there is this. They found their way to each other, and it cost them both, and it was worth it. It usually is the things that cost you. Thank you for watching. If this story found you at the right time, leave us a comment below. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, welcome. There are more stories where this one came from. We will see you in the next one.